So I'd like to begin my testimony by looking at the narrative review of the literature to help understand how we even came to associate the component parts of the diet-heart hypothesis, dietary fat, cholesterol and heart disease. The first part of the diet-heart hypothesis, and I've taken this exactly from the Ansel-Keys summary of the 7-country study, and these were his verbatim conclusions as presented in the final part of his 20-volume report, the 7-country study. First of all, he said that the incident rate of coronary heart disease tends to be directly related to the distributions of serum cholesterol values. Serum just means blood cholesterol values. The average blood cholesterol values of the cohorts, the 16 parts of countries that Ansel-Keys studied, so there were 7 countries and 16 cohorts within those 7 countries, they tended to be related to the average proportion of calories provided by saturated fats in the diet. And then the third part was that coronary heart disease incident rates of the cohorts are just as closely related to the dietary saturated fat as to the blood cholesterol level. So we had this relationship established between blood cholesterol levels, dietary saturated fat and coronary heart disease. But just how accurate were those relationships? So let's first look at the origin of cholesterol as a coronary heart disease risk factor. And this dates back to the work of Russian pathologists back in the early 1900s, where they were observing human corpses and doing autopsies in those corpses and noticing that cholesterol tended to be congregated around the areas of damage that they were examining in the arteries. And they then progressed to doing animal experiments to see if they could recreate those fatty deposits in arteries in animals. And particularly they studied rabbits, and rabbits were fed animal foods and then developed fatty deposits in their arteries. But rats fed animal foods did not develop the same arterial damage, and rabbits fed cholesterol in plant food showed no arterial damage. And the key thing that wasn't picked up, well, it was actually picked up by one researcher called Knack, who did a paper on this in 1915, and Knack spotted that rabbits are, of course, herbivores, so they cannot digest animal foods, and dietary cholesterol is only found in foods of animal origin, so that's meat, fish, eggs and dairy products. So that's what the rabbits needed to be fed to deliver them dietary cholesterol, and of course the rabbits could not digest those foods. So perhaps it was the foods that they were being fed and not the cholesterol in itself that was causing the arterial damage. And indeed, by feeding rabbits cholesterol in plant food and showing that there was no arterial damage, that hypothesis of Knack was supported. We now look at blood cholesterol and coronary heart disease, and an association was observed between blood cholesterol levels and coronary heart disease. However, it was based on a very small number of small studies. All of the studies would fail the Bradford Hill criteria, and age was a clear confounder. So if you looked at the relationship and didn't adjust for age, age was the predominant factor that impacted heart disease. So I then personally have looked at blood cholesterol and cardiovascular disease and all-cause mortality from the World Health Organization data, not for 7 countries, but for all 192 countries for which there is data available. And this is what I found. This is looking at cardiovascular disease deaths and blood cholesterol levels in males in all 192 countries for which the World Health Organization has data. And as you can see from this graph, there is a very slight downwards trend showing that the higher one's cholesterol level, the lower the number of deaths per 100,000 citizens, and conversely, the lower one's cholesterol level, the higher the incidence of cardiovascular disease deaths in males. Now, the trend downwards is not strong. The R is 0.133 and the R squared, conversely, is 0.018. That gives us an indication of the strength of the relationship, but the trend is quite clearly downwards and not upwards, as we have been told. If we now look at cardiovascular disease deaths and blood cholesterol levels in females, the relationship gets quite a bit stronger. We now have an R of 0.5 and an R squared of 0.269, and the downwards trend is much stronger. We now look at all deaths, all-cause mortality and blood cholesterol levels in males, and the downwards trend gets stronger still. We've got an R ratio of 0.658 and an R squared of 0.433, and we can clearly see the downwards trend showing the higher the cholesterol levels, the lower the deaths from all causes, and the lower the cholesterol levels, the higher the deaths from all causes. And the strongest relationship of the four comes from all deaths and cholesterol levels in females. And the downwards trend shows an R of 0.738 and an R squared of 0.544, which is a strong R squared and a strong R, indicating a strong relationship between lower cholesterol and higher death rates. This is, of course, the exact opposite of what the majority of people believe. We turn now to dietary cholesterol and blood cholesterol levels, and this is not widely known. Ansel Keys, the person who is held to be responsible for the diet-heart hypothesis, originally tried to establish if dietary cholesterol had an impact on blood cholesterol levels, and he concluded absolutely unequivocally that it did not. And here's a quote from one of his studies in the early 1950s. The evidence, both from experiments and from field surveys, indicates that cholesterol content in itself of all natural diets has no significant effect on either the cholesterol level or the development of atherosclerosis in man. And that's very interesting, because if it has no impact on blood cholesterol levels or atherosclerosis levels, given that cholesterol is only found in foods of animal origin, and to do those clinical trials on humans, Keys therefore had to feed those humans a large quantity of foods of animal origin to increase their dietary cholesterol levels, then he has simultaneously exonerated animal foods. If cholesterol has no effect, then feeding those humans food of animal origin also had no effect. So at the time that Keys exonerated animal foods in blood cholesterol levels, he also exonerated animal foods in the development of atherosclerosis in man. His own words, but this connection has not been made. We now move to dietary fat and blood cholesterol levels, because having tried to find a relationship between dietary cholesterol and blood cholesterol and having failed, Keys then turned his attention to dietary fat. A far more logical macronutrient to have examined would have been carbohydrate, because in feeding his human subjects foods of animal origin, he had in effect tested both fat and protein. What he had not tested was carbohydrate, but he didn't realise that. His nutritional knowledge was perhaps not as great as it could have been, so he turned his attention to fat. And he stated that blood cholesterol is independent of cholesterol intake, but fat intake is quite another matter. However, there's not the slightest evidence for a difference between animal and vegetable fat. That was his early view, and he was very confused between animal and vegetable fat. He would generally tend to call animal fat saturated and vegetable fat unsaturated, and we'll see in just a moment that that is not the case. However, all foods with fat contain all three fats. That's the point I've just made. Animal fats are not saturated, plant fats are not unsaturated. Every food on the planet that contains fat, which would include meat, fish, dairy products, eggs, nuts, seeds, avocados, olives, and indeed even some grains and fruits contain traces of fat. Every food that contains fats contains monounsaturated fat, polyunsaturated fat, and saturated fat. We cannot call animal fats saturated any more than we can call plant fats unsaturated. So no dietary experiment can actually change or measure one thing. The closest that a dietary experiment can do is to change one oil for another, and then the only macronutrient affected is fat. Protein and carbohydrate are left unchanged, but the types of fat in the macronutrient fat all change even if we just change oils in the diet. So we can't do that dietary experiment that just changes one thing. And another important thing to note, and I've got a paper on this that I did with Professor Julian Baker, is that there is a way by which vegetable oils can lower cholesterol, but this has shown not to be heart healthy. So plants, for example, particularly vegetable oils, contain plant sterols, which is in effect plant cholesterol. And when humans consume those vegetable oils, all those foods containing plant sterols, and indeed some foods are manufactured like margarines and some yogurts, particularly to include plant sterols, they fight in the gut of the human to effectively replace human cholesterol with that plant cholesterol. Now, surely the body wants the cholesterol that it makes for the human body, which is the perfect cholesterol for the human body. It doesn't want plant cholesterol. I suggest that if it did want plant cholesterol, it would make plant cholesterol. And the paper that I did with Professor Baker looked at all the evidence where plant sterols had effectively lowered cholesterol, but the impact on heart disease was significant and quite serious. So this is not a good thing for humans to be doing, but it is a way by which vegetable oils can lower cholesterol, but we should not be fooled into thinking that this is a good thing. So for some dietary fat ignorance, because it's very important to clear up some of the misconceptions about dietary fat. There are 3 real fats: saturated, monounsaturated and polyunsaturated. And the picture of the saturated fat here explains why it's called a saturated fat, because we have the middle chain of carbon atoms, and everywhere where there is a carbon atom, there is a hydrogen atom on each side. So we describe this top fat, the saturated fat, as fully saturated with hydrogen atoms. Every space where there is a possibility of having a hydrogen atom, there is a hydrogen atom present. So it is fully saturated with hydrogens. The monounsaturated fat, in contrast, has one place, mono meaning one, where we have a pair of hydrogen atoms missing and therefore the double bonded carbon chain. And in the case of polyunsaturated fats, this happens more than once. It can only be twice. Poly can just mean twice when it comes to polyunsaturated fats. And the bottom diagram shows those 2 double bonds where the hydrogen atoms are missing. That's chemically the difference between those 3 fats. And they are all real fats, and they are all found in all foods that contain fat. None of them are better or worse than any others. The only fat that human beings need to avoid is the industrially produced trans fatty acids, which are made by food manufacturers. The second interesting factoid about fat is that only one food group contains more saturated than unsaturated fat. Again, not that saturated is better or worse than unsaturated, but just to set the record straight. So I present this slide quite often at conferences, and I ask the audience to say which of these foods contains more saturated than unsaturated fat. And we have a sirloin steak, eggs, oily fish, represented here by mackerel, lard, almonds, olive oil, and low-fat milk. And it surprises the audience to point out that the only food on that chart with more saturated than unsaturated fat is the low-fat milk. It has just 1% saturated fat and 0.6% saturated fat, but of course that means there's only 0.4% unsaturated fat. So the numbers that have just gone up on this slide are to show that per 100 grams of food, so these directly translate into percentages, sirloin steak, and this is a standard product from the United States Department of Agriculture database. It's not one I've picked to try and make the numbers look better than they are. This is one of their standard products. Sirloin steak overall is just 7% fat and 2.1% saturated fat. Eggs, total fat 10%, saturated fat 3%. Oily fish, lard. I do feel it's important to point out that the main fat in lard is actually monounsaturated fat, and not many people know that. And then you can use nutritional information to show that our dietary messages are not sound, they are not sensible when you understand the nutritional content of food. So for example, we're told to eat oily fish and avoid red meat because of our requirements for total fat and saturated fat. And yet we can see that oily fish has twice the total fat and 1.5 times the saturated fat of sirloin steak. Oily fish is great and sirloin steak is great, but we shouldn't demonise one and promote the other in the name of fat when it is illogical to do so. And olive oil, which has been promoted so highly recently, particularly in the context of a fictitious Mediterranean diet that has been put together by researchers, olive oil has 14 times the total fat and 7 times the saturated fat of the sirloin steak. And we wouldn't eat 100 grams of olive oil, but a tablespoon of olive oil has more saturated fat than a 100 gram pork chop. So this is to point out that our dietary guidelines don't make sense when one understands about nutrition. Looking at dietary fat and coronary heart disease, and we're back to Ancel Keys now, because Ancel Keys would not move away from his belief that dietary fat was the component that was most important in coronary heart disease. And indeed, this is one of his quotations, again from the 1950s, where he asserts no other variable in the mode of life besides the fat calories in the diet is known which shows anything like such a consistent relationship to the mortality rate from coronary or degenerative heart disease. But this statement referenced Keyes' own 1953 presentation, and he went on to reject any relationship with coronary heart disease and total fat in the 7 countries study. That's not widely known. At the end of the 7 countries study, Keyes said he found no relationship whatsoever between total fat in the diet and coronary heart disease. He changed his view to say that any relationship found was between saturated fat and coronary heart disease. Now, this has been shown in Professor Noakes' presentation, his presentation number 3, slide number 3, and it's a chart that's well known for looking at just 6 countries and showing that there was a strong relationship between heart disease in men of a certain age and deaths per 1,000 men in the population, and the fat calories as a percentage of the total diet. But as was pointed out by Professor Noakes also in his presentation, and by Yerushalmi and Hilibo, there were far more country data available. 22 countries, in fact, had data available, and yet Keyes chose data from just 6 countries to make his point about the relationship between dietary fat and coronary heart disease. And that's not scientific, that's what we would call scientific mischief. So the context for the 7 country study, what was Keyes' belief system at the point of going into the 7 country study? First, he was convinced that dietary cholesterol had no impact on blood cholesterol or atherosclerosis. He was convinced that blood cholesterol was impacted by fat intake, and at the time he didn't believe that animal or fat intake, vegetable fat intake, made any difference. He was convinced that fat calories in the diet provided the most consistent relationship with coronary heart disease mortality, and he knew that by having Japan and the US on a line, they would actually form the 2 endpoints of the line to represent a relationship with dietary fat intake and coronary heart disease. And Italy was on that line of the 6 countries also. Keyes had friends in Greece, Italy, Finland, Japan, Netherlands and Yugoslavia, and of course in the United States. And those were the 7 countries that he chose to do the 7 country study. So that's the context for this study that ended up being perhaps the most important dietary study to influence dietary guidelines going forward. And the conclusions of the 7-country study, as we said at the beginning of this section of this presentation, were that the incident rate of coronary heart disease tends to be related to blood cholesterol levels. Blood cholesterol levels tend to be related to the proportion of calories coming from saturated fat in the diet. And the coronary heart disease incidence rates tend to be related to saturated fats just as they do the blood cholesterol levels. So it was that tripartite relationship between saturated fat, coronary heart disease and cholesterol levels that Keyes established at the end of the 7-country study. But we should note the use of those words tends to be related to. That is not a strong assertion of causation or of evidence. It's just an observed association and of things tending to be observed at the same time as each other. No relationships was claimed with total fat, despite a strong conviction before the 7-country study that total fat was the single most important thing as a determinant of coronary heart disease. And the relationship for coronary heart disease deaths at 25 years on from the start of the 7-country study and the blood cholesterol levels at the start of that study was an R, a correlation coefficient of 0.72, which meant that the R squared was 0.52, and that's looking at the 16 cohorts separately, not the 7 countries. So I did some original research putting in those numbers to establish the exact methodology that Keyes had used to get those numbers, to be confident that I could replicate them if I took a different variable. And the variable that I observed had a much stronger relationship with coronary heart disease was looking at coronary heart disease deaths and the latitude of the cohort. And I established an R correlation coefficient of 0.93 and therefore an R squared of 0.86, which is very strong, almost as close a perfect relationship as you would be able to establish in science between coronary heart disease deaths and the latitude of the cohorts. If you look at the coronary heart disease deaths and the latitude of the countries, the relationship becomes almost perfect, 0.96 and R squared of 0.92. I may not see a stronger correlation between two variables in the rest of my life as a researcher. That's how strong that relationship is. And does it make sense? Actually, it does make sense, because when sunshine shines on the skin, the cholesterol synthesis then turns the cholesterol in the skin into vitamin D. So in countries closer to the equator, where the latitude shows that they're closer to the equator, people get more access to sunshine, and therefore more of the cholesterol in the skin is turned into vitamin D. So the cholesterol in that cohort is lower, and the coronary heart disease deaths are lower. But is it the cholesterol being lower that has lowered the coronary heart disease deaths, or is it the fact that the vitamin D is higher? And a great deal of work has been done, not least with Professor Scragg in New Zealand, to show that indeed vitamin D and heart disease have a very important relationship. I was not the only person to look for alternative relationships between coronary heart disease and cholesterol and dietary fat and the variables that Keyes was looking at. Keyes' great nemesis, Professor John Yudkin, who believed that it was sugar that was the problem and not dietary fat, he found his best correlation was between coronary heart disease mortality and the number of radio and television licenses, and the correlation with motor vehicles was nearly as good. This may seem amusing, perhaps even a little bit bizarre, but it shows that affluence can be a clear confounder in coronary heart disease, and that the richer people were, particularly in the 1950s, the more likely they were to have a television set or a radio or a motor vehicle. And we know that affluence gives protection against disease because people have better access to good food and good health care, even back 60 years ago. So in summary, what the 7-country study really found was that the death rate from coronary heart disease for those who had previous existing heart disease at the start of the 7-country study, when those people who'd already had a myocardial infarction, a heart attack, were studied during the 5 years of the 7-country study, the death rate of those people was almost 21%. In contrast, the death rate over 5 years of the men who hadn't had a heart attack was just 1%. So what the 7-country study in fact showed is that the single biggest cause of coronary heart disease is coronary heart disease. We did not consider involving women because of the great rarity of cardiac events among them. That was a quote from one of Keyes's closest colleagues, Henry Blackburn. But then we know that women have higher cholesterol than men, and women suffer much lower heart disease than men. Particularly, that was the case at the time that this diet heart hypothesis was being developed. So immediately we have the case that 50% of the population disproves the cholesterol hypothesis, and yet the hypothesis still got off the ground. And Keyes also was aware of the confounders of war in his 7-country study. So by starting the study in 1956, he was studying male survivors of war, and the regions that he'd studied in Europe, particularly Finland, where the death rates were particularly high. Finland was ravaged during the Second World War, and indeed East Finland had the highest death rate of all the cohorts. And East Finland notoriously had fought with Germany, against the Soviet Union. North Korea had been seized by the Soviet Union, 400,000 people had been displaced, and this had the highest death rate of the 16 cohorts. Now, Keyes did say in another study that one needed to be careful of attributing wartime changes to atherosclerosis, and yet he did that in effect in his 7-country study. What the 7-country study kept quiet, in effect, was that this was not a robust dietary study. On average, 3.4% of the almost 13,000 men were sampled, and most of the 7-country study publications of the individual cohorts made no mention whatsoever of dietary fat. 6 cohorts had essentially the same cholesterol levels and an 11-fold difference in coronary heart disease deaths. So a large proportion of the cohorts undermined even the conclusions of the 7-country study itself. And Keyes dismissed smoking, sedentary behaviour, obesity and relative weight as factors in coronary heart disease in any situation. And this was not widely known, so we took his findings on saturated fat with great weight, while knowing at the same time that he was wrong about smoking, sedentary behaviour, obesity and weight. And as Professor Peter Elwood has explained, an inter-country study is the lowest form of evidence. What Keyes is trying to have us believe is that Japan being at the bottom of the graph for coronary heart disease deaths and saturated fat intake, and America being at the top, is entirely due to the saturated fat content of the diet, not GDP, not climate, not politics, not the national health provision, not the family scenario, the communities, the support system that is known in Japan that may be very, very different in America. All of that we were supposed to dismiss and to only believe that saturated fat alone made any difference. Now, the 5 peer studies, the other epidemiological studies that were performed at around the same time as the 7-country study, they had none of those confounders because they studied the same populations and compared saturated fat intake in the same population with people who consumed less saturated fat and looked at the development of heart disease. And they found no relationship whatsoever once those confounders were not in place. But the 7-country study was very much the study of the day and taken as the one that determined our dietary guidelines going forward.